Another morning is here. In other words, another Monday morning is here, I should say. Although now I'm releasing these on Sunday morning, so I probably should have said that. Anyway, this is a little rundown I gave you on just, it seems like simple stuff, but sometimes what seems like simple stuff can bite you. And you ever had one of those jobs that you started and you felt like, well, this is going to be a simple job, and then the more you worked on it, the more irritating it became. Something as simple as pulling the wheels off cars. I'd send students to say, take these, jerk the tires off that car over and let's look at the brakes. And they come over and say, we can't get the lug nuts off. And I'd say, oh, what's the matter with y'all? And somebody go over, and sure enough, they'd be fighting with 2 or 3 lug nuts that were spinning around and around and wouldn't come off. I mean, sometimes what seems like a simple job turns out to be a little harder than you expect. Now, our job is to maintain and repair. That's kind of like that police thing, to serve and protect, to maintain and repair. When you put this on the back of your shirt, you can get it embroidered back there if you're willing to pay somebody to do it. But a lot of what we do is just scheduled maintenance. Basically, whenever one comes in, if you're somebody if you're working on your own vehicle, or if you're working on a lot of other people's vehicles, scheduled maintenance, basically oil changes, quote unquote tune-ups. What's a tune-up anymore? Used to it was points, plugs, and condenser. Nowadays it basically looks at scanning for codes, cleaning the throttle body, oxygen sensor, switching, check, and all that. Scanning the data stream to see what you see, and replacing the plugs, obviously, and stuff like that. Making sure there's nothing else out of line under the hood that needs to be fixed. All right, so whenever extra effort is required, like sometimes simply these kind of fuel lines here, you take the special tool, you're going to you're going to either disconnect these lines from the fuel pump, or you're going to disconnect them from the fuel filter, and they're all loaded with dirt and grit. And what will happen is sometimes you'll see these little fingers here will bend to the point to where you can't get the fuel line disconnected. I don't know how many times I've seen noobs do that. They give these people that don't really have a lot of experience or training the job of replacing, changing oil, replacing filters and stuff like that. And so they get under there and they get in big trouble because they cram that tool up in there, and then all it does is distort the fingers so that you'll have to really do extraordinary miracles to get the thing out of there with a pick or whatever. But anyway, if you take out, before you ever start, if you'll wash that thing out up in here with brake parts cleaner and blow it really good with air, and then follow up with some lubricant like WD-40 or PB Blaster or whatever, even some of that silicone spray, you'll typically be able to just pull this thing right out of there. But if you just try to force it and cram it when the thing's got particles of dirt and grit in there, it may not even look dirty, but it'll have stuff in there a lot of the time that you can't see, the stuff that's flown up in there and got trapped. And when you don't know how to take the thing loose, when it looks funky like this, you need to do some research or be really careful and figure it out. This was on my pickup, the 2007 F-150. Pop that little retainer loose, pull it out, real easy, stick it back in, click. There you go. Sorry if I was talking over myself, but that's basically an example of one that's not like some of the others. Okay, be careful not to break plastic things on gas tanks. I used to tell these students when they were pulling fuel tanks off, that if you break one of those little plastic nipples off of that gas tank, it's not really easy to fix, and furthermore, you don't want to have to buy an entire gas tank, although you may have to. And some of the stuff that people break, that students in training break, they have the idea that, well, if I break it, it's just a piece of plastic, we can get another one from the parts store. Well, to begin with, the parts store doesn't have everything. They got more stuff now than they used to have. But there's a lot of stuff that you break, you can't get it from anywhere at the dealer, and then they say, well, you can't get that by itself. It comes with the whole rest of the part, and it's going to be $600. This kind of thing. I don't know how many times you've ran into that trying to train somebody. But that just drives me crazy whenever lowering a gas tank's a perfect example of that, because there's a lot of stuff connected to these gas tanks now that if you're not lowering that gas tank really slowly with a transmission jack or something and looking to make sure there's nothing still connected to it, you can cause yourself a lot of problems and cost the shop a lot of money, or cost yourself a lot of money. But anyway, that's just something that was, this was a sort of a example of something that got, broke on a plastic gas tank when they were dropping it down. Be careful with those stiff steel fuel lines. This one here was one that was connected to the fuel system on one of them CSFI systems, if I'm not mistaken, right? And the student basically wasn't sure whether it was started good or not. He just started trying to force it in there with a wrench, and he wound up screwing these threads up. And there's not a really good repair kit for this anywhere that I've been able to find, although some of you guys may. If you've got an old, donor vehicle out there, you may be able to figure out a way to fix this. But this thing right here was a kind of a disaster. Seems to me like I managed to get a thread file after this and got it straightened out. Oxygen sensors, sometimes when you go ready to take them out, because somebody may have screwed them out and screwed them back in without putting the anti-seize compound on them, the threads may come with the sensor, and then you got to have an 18 millimeter 1.5 pitch thread pitch tap to fix those oxygen sensor threads. I mean, these are examples of simple jobs that turn out to be a lot harder than you would have expected them to be, and sometimes that thing's just not easy to get to up there. But anyway, you can also take one of the little spark plug rethreading kits, because it'll have the 18 millimeter step threads on it, and it may fit in there better than a regular tap and all. Anyway, there's a lot of stuff you can run into that costs a lot of extra work when it should be take it out and put it back in. We start it with our fingers and go as far as we can. Brake lines are the same way. You can't just, like if you're going to start a bolt or a nut or something like that, you can just move it around until you get it right, and then when it screws in there, you can tell. But that line is liable to be tweaked a little bit and liable to be holding it just a little bit crooked. This is a real common thing on brake lines, and you got to be paying really close attention. And it's good if you can see it with a light, so you can see if it's a little crooked and you bend it a little bit with your wrench to get it straight where it'll go in there. But anybody that doesn't have any real, a lot of field experience is able to just be in a hurry wanting to get through with the job, particularly if they're working on commission, and get a little bit too aggressive and mess things up. Kits are available for fuel lines. You can get all these different retainers that come, but they're not available for everything. Now, there's a lot of kits out there. There's a lot of people out there. I was telling one of the Ford engineers one time, whenever I was up at the Power Stroke plant, and also at we were at some meeting where there were some Ford guys, and some really, really high up guy in Ford Service Engineering came over there, and I said, look, you need to make these wire harness connectors available as pigtails for all of these harnesses, because it's a lot less intrusive to replace just a broken pigtail than it is to replace an entire wire harness. It's also cheaper and under warranty to do this. And I said, but you got all these wire connectors that are different from any other wire connector anywhere. Now, they do have these flip charts with these connectors and all that you can get a lot of them. GM's got one, Motorcraft's got one. I've seen those things, and they work pretty good. You can actually find. The problem is, you may find a connector that's exactly like you need, and it's $90. Of course, usually the wire harness is $200 or $300, $90 for the connector, and the connector will have all the same color wires coming out of it. So you got to be careful how you splice that back in. You got to make your connections right and all that. But that wire harnesses are kind of like that. These repair kits, though, for fuel lines, there's few repair kits available. There's people who say, well, how can we solve this problem that's independent shops are having in the field? And because it's really, a lot of the time this plastic gets old and it gets brittle and you're trying to take a fuel line off, or you'll have one that leaks or something like that. Somebody will pop it on. You've seen these kind of things right here, and that right there is a kit that you can get. It's just an end that you put on there. Putting these kind of fittings on them stiff plastic fuel lines is very difficult. I developed a way to replace just the fitting on some of the factory Ford ones, and I would take a tubing, flare tool that was in it, clamp it down around that plastic line. It's just exactly the right size, and it would bite it and it would hold it, and then I would put that fitting, and if you didn't slide that thing over the final third barb on that connector, when you're just putting it back together, it would just pop back off of there, and you wind up losing a tank of fuel and make fire hazard and all that kind of stuff. So you got to be conscientious when you're fixing this stuff, because a lot of the times, if you cause a fuel leak because you didn't do something right, or because you didn't put it back together the right way, then that's a liability thing too. All right, so designs vary. Chevys for years, lots of Chevys had the fuel line O-ring with an O-ring like this. This is different from the previous one I showed that was messed up. But there are, this little O-ring right here, if it happens to come off there, you got issues. But you can break out loose, screw it off of there. Fairly easy to fix, put it back on. The good thing about a fuel filter is you can hold the fuel filter in your hand and change the angle while you're screwing it on the line if you need to. So anyway, that's just for what it's worth. There it is. These Ford spring lock couplings are solid. They're tough. There's a little tool you use to stretch the internal garter spring that you can see right here. If you just slide this on here, lubricate those O-rings a little bit, it'll go click. And that O-ring, when it drops over that lip right there, you will not get that thing to come back off of there unless you take that tool and it spreads the spring and it lets it pull back out. Funny thing about this, we were doing a lot of cleaning of injectors back in the 80s and 90s and early 90s. And we had an injector cleaning machine, and that was just a standard thing to clean people's injectors. A lot of those olefins were getting, the stuff was getting trapped on the injector tips and all that. And the problem with that is these lines right here are used on a lot of the earlier Fords, both on the air conditioning and on the fuel. And there's, several different sizes of these things here too, and different colored tools. And there was a guy over there that was sort of sent him in training. He was basically just there as a helper, just because he needed a job. He really wasn't interested in learning a whole lot about working on cars. And he was an older guy anyway. And his name was Ted. And he was unhooking these fuel lines and hooking the injector cleaner up. They showed him how to do that, And one day he pulled his Bronco 2 in there, and it was facing my service bay, and I was on the other side of some toolboxes and stuff that I had lined up there. And he took the high pressure AC line loose, and it blew refrigerant out of there, and it blew the orifice tube all the way across the parking lot. It was just really a mess. I had to put all that back together and put an orifice tube in it and get it sucked down, charged back up, and all that. And then he had to hook it up. Well, he had TPS, this. What soldiers come back from, his TPMS or whatever. What do they call that? That's not TPMS. PTSD. He had traumatic, issues with taking those lines loose. And I saw him over there getting ready to take a fuel line loose, and he was actually on the fuel line working on another one. And I was standing probably, 8 feet away from him. And as soon as he pulled the thing loose, I sprayed. He made a big air sound. I didn't even put it in his direction. I just kind of blew it up in the air above his head, where he could feel it on his hat. You don't want to blow too close on somebody with air because it's really dangerous. But standing 8 feet away, I wasn't going to hurt the guy. But it scared the living daylights out of him because he just knew he had made that air conditioner issue again. Anyway, don't get don't get close to somebody with an air hose. There was a boy in Turkey that they killed him by playing a prank with an air hose. I read about in the news the other day. A bunch of other guys in the shop. The Chrysler Dodge Way and some of the GM stuff, they have these neat little tabs, and you can pinch those in and unplug it. Well, a lot of times this will try to stay with the fuel line, this plastic part. That's okay. It's not a big deal. You take it off the fuel line very carefully, and you put it back up in this shell. And then whenever you get ready to put it back in, you go click. It's real easy. No special tool required on those. But you need to know if you have to have a special tool, you need to have the special tool. Some of the special tools will only work on one particular kind of line. I could have had a bunch of examples with me. I had to buy a bunch of tools like that. Disconnecting transmission cooler lines from the radiator require special tools on some vehicles, even later model ones. So you got to make sure you know what you're looking for here. Now, on an old Camry we worked on one day, the fuel filter had never been replaced, had over 150,000 miles on it. It was an 89 model. How hard could it be? We're replacing a fuel filter, y'all. This one got a banjo bolt on the top, copper washer, banjo bolt, banjo fitting. And that's, real, and it was facing up, real simple, easy to get to. And it had a, standard inverted flare nut on the bottom. All right, so it's an easy job. It became a hard job. This otherwise routine Camry fuel filter replacement turned out to be a problem-solving exercise. Students didn't know what to do about it because it just wasn't cooperating. All right, so it's so simple that Toyota doesn't even tell you how to do it. This is how the shop manual reads. Toyota does not provide specific instructions for fuel filter replacement, but important related procedures are discussed under service precautions. Really? Fuel filter is right down there on that particular one, and it was there for a while. Translation, you're on your own. How hard can it be, though? I mean, hey, it's just a fuel filter. We've taken fuel filters off, putting them back on before. It would seem simple, and it should be. This one had its filter mounted on the driver's side shock tower, which I just showed a minute ago. The guy that I had working on it got the banjo bolts out easy enough, but the flare nut was seized in the filter, and even if he held it with a wrench or whatever he wanted to do, it would not budge. Couldn't get the fuel line on the opposite end to break loose. It was a plain old flare nut. Used a line wrench like we were supposed to. Even put some valve grinding compound on it. I tried it. May as well have been welded in there. I don't know why. How does this happen? Why does it get this way? It was put on there. It looked like at a factory. The more we fiddled with it, the worse it got, and the more we rounded it off. So what we need to do now, to call in and say what we need to do. Is there a kit available for this, or can I get a fuel line? Well, checking the options, I found out before we cut the line, which I knew we were going to have to do. I called Toyota, and there was no repair kit, and a fuel line would be more than $100. We didn't want to spend $100 when all we did was start out to replace a fuel filter. Okay, so now we had to win. You're in it, now you got to win it. It wasn't negotiable, so we cut the thing off, no other choice. Now, actually, we cut the line farther back from this, but then we cut it off right up even with the nut, like you see here. This is an actual photo of that thing, and we needed a reliable, professional way to put a new filter on there the right way, and so we needed to engineer something. So I said, well, this fitting right here screws into that filter really, really good. It is not pipe thread in the filter, but it's close enough that this would screw in there and work. I mean, it would basically, yeah, the threads are tapered, but it's screwed in there, and we're not sealing around the threads. I'll show you something about that in a minute. So here we go. So the threads don't have to seal. All they have to do is press this inverted cone. A seat, in other words, inverted seat against a mashing cone. See, there's a seat in there, and the threads on that nut, that's where the sealing takes place, and this is where it flows. Now, you're not sealing around the threads. You don't have to seal around the threads. Some people, when they got a brake lines, by the way, and for transmission lines will crack sometimes right here. And you'll see a bunch of fluid flowing out between the nut and the line. The right way to do that is to put a new, slide the nut back, double flare the line, put it back in there. But some of the older guys used to take this thing off and they'd wrap a bunch of Teflon tape around the line, and then they'd put it back in there so that Teflon tape would seal up that crack and it wouldn't leak anymore. But that used to be really common, not so much on brake lines, but on transmission cooler lines we used to see this. But the fittings are different the way they seal. Like you say, you can see the words that type themselves on here. Alright, so we needed to modify this fitting. We're going to have to start by doing something with it. We're basically only going to use the part of it at the top for a nut. So we're going to cut this barbed part of it off so that we've got something that looks a lot like the nut that we just had there. And once again, this is 1/4-inch pipe. It's 1/4-inch pipe to 3/8 hose was the original fitting right there. Alright, so we had this little ridge down in here. See that little ridge? That little ridge was, you could stick the line in from this direction. It would stop when it hit that ridge. I said, well, that ridge needs to be gone. That's not a big deal. This is a brass fitting after all. Not that hard to ream the ridge out. Just get a good drill bit, run that drill down in there, and we got that thing cleared out so that we had built ourselves the brass version of the nut that was originally on that thing. Alright, we stuck the line through there. This is what it looked like. It was a perfect fit. This is already looking really good, and of course we had to polish all of this off and sand it and everything, to get that. There's a little bit of a coating on the outside of this fuel line. We needed to get that off so it could go through there. Alright, on to the next step. We had to double flare it. If you don't know how to double flare, you need to, because that's really important to double flare brake lines. And because whenever you're putting brake lines together, you need to use a double flare union instead of don't use a copper tubing union. I'll talk about that again in a minute. But you can see what we did here. We double flared it, and we got it ready to go back up into the filter. And we were then able to attach the line to the filter. Now, sealing the deal was what we did here, with the line made a 90-degree bend just below the filter. We cut that bend off with the tubing cutter. That's actually how we originally got the filter out of there. And then we reattached the line with a brass 3/8 copper tubing union. That works great for a fuel line, but don't use it on brake lines. It's a bad idea. Fuel systems only have about 40 psi of pressure usually, and brake lines can have up to 2,000 pounds of pressure, and a copper tubing union is not a safe way to handle that. It may blow it apart. And so once they got that back in there, speaking of copper tubing unions, I got another little short thing here. There was a girl that we came into the shop, and she had a little fan on the dash. It was a really hot summer, and her little VW Beetle, that was one of the new Beetles, the air conditioner had a leak, and she had gone to a shop, and they said, oh, you're going to need a condenser, and it's going to cost $400, and she didn't have any money. And so we found out there was a line that was running up next to that condenser that was part of the condenser, and it had been right there where the strap was around it. It had, had flexed enough to where it cracked that line right there, and that's where the refrigerant was leaving. Well, that line was part of the condenser, but I said, let's get serious here. Take that strap off of there, and a 3/8 copper tubing union would fit perfectly on that thing. It was just exactly what we needed on there. And of course, I know that line was like a 10 millimeter or something like that, but it doesn't matter. That 3/8 copper tubing union was close enough to where we were able to put that copper tubing union on there, tighten it up, repair the leak on that line, and get her air conditioner going again for the cost of a copper tubing union and some refrigerant. And boy, was she ever happy, But you can do amazing things with copper tubing unions, but don't fix brake lines with them. All right, this was a really, really good little fix, I think. I don't know if you guys had a good time with this or not, but I hope that you enjoyed the video, and I hope you'll come back and see me next time. Let me know what you think about this, or if you got anything out of it, or if it was a waste of your time or whatever. I'll talk to you next week.